director of research. I've had a role in drafting this model science policy code, and I'll be presenting it. Now, sorry, I will just mention first. So this is going from about 2 to 3:30, and our guests are, uh, and I'm delighted to have them. Thank you again so much. Darren Baxt, the director of the Competitive Enterprise Institute's Center for Energy and Environment, and formerly of the Heritage Foundation, where he worked for a decade on issues such as advancing sound science and transparency. John Cardarelli II, past president of the Health Physics Society, author of Overt Scientific Bias and Clandestine Acts by Trusted Scientists, the flawed application of the linear no threshold model, to speaking in a personal capacity, particularly on the search for truth in science behind cancer risk assessment in low dose environments. Then Marlo Lewis Jr., senior fellow, also at the Competitive Enterprise Institute in Energy and Environmental Policy, a free market public policy institute headquartered in Washington, D.C. His current research interests chiefly include the science, economics, law, and politics of climate and energy policy. So, what we're going to be doing is, yours truly is not just moderator, but presenting. I will try to keep that, I hope it'll be no more than 10 minutes to get through, in fact, the outlines of a series of pieces of model legislation dealing with science, which together collectively form a modern science policy code. Then each of our speakers, and I think alphabetical order by last name, is going to speak, 12 to 14 minutes. It will then be up to digital Q&A and moderated conversation. That means you, the attendees, please put in stuff either into chat or into the Q&A button at bottom. Maybe stick to one or the other if you can. I think people are already doing chat, so if at all possible, stick to that, but not required. And then I will simply choose questions from there. I may lob questions to various of the speakers, and they can just talk to one another in a happy way. If we get to the end of the 90 minutes and your questions have not been answered, don't worry. Send email to me, Randall at nas.org, Randall at nas.org, and I'll be delighted to forward your questions to the panelists so they can have the option to answer you. Also, if you have to leave suddenly, don't worry. This gets recorded and for perpetuity on the National Association of Scholars YouTube channel, and that's usually within 24 hours. So this will be available for everybody to see. I think that's the business. So I'm going to go straight to, in effect, a presentation of this model science policy code and why it's necessary. And why it's necessary. Federal science policy has inflicted, it's a fourfold crisis on America. The worst of these crises is a crisis of liberty. Our laws and regulations now encourage technocrats and radical activists embedded in government service, to promote false research to justify illiberal regulatory policy. And the other three crises are nearly as grave. Our laws and regulations allow universities to overcharge the federal government in its grants. Federal grant money imposes discriminatory and illiberal diversity, equity, and inclusion, DEI, policies on universities. And then finally, our laws permit universities to be culpably complacent about scientific espionage conducted above all by China, but also by other foreign powers. So, altogether, our science policy, destroys American liberty, wastes taxpayer money, imposes group identity discrimination, and endangers our national security. So we believe that American citizens and policymakers must meet these challenges by means of an urgent and comprehensive program, and thereby solve this fourfold crisis by comprehensive, coherent reform of American science policy. And we're putting this as a model federal science code, policy code. We think it ought to be done by federal legislation, both because some of the needed reforms require legislation, and because all the needed reforms should be hardwired into federal policy. Executive orders can substitute for legislation to a certain extent, but it's far easier to reverse an executive order than it is to change a law. That's why the NAS has drafted the Model Science Policy Code. And these are 10 individual pieces of model legislation, that are meant to inspire policymakers and the public to work for concerted reform of federal science policy. And yeah, their language, their principles might also inspire executive orders, but we would prefer for these reforms to be statutes. And we do believe that the code, if enacted in full, would do an extraordinary amount to realign federal science policy with liberty and the public welfare. I will just interrupt to say, and they're not meant to solve everything in the world. The world is full of problems. Federal science policy is full of problems. This is a tool to solve a considerable amount of stuff that's going wrong. But yeah, it's not everything in the world. Just so we have that clear. But yeah, we believe these bills articulate reforms that should be articulated, enacted, simply because they are good policy. And, federal law should require best existing practices to ensure reproducibility in science the government funds, or uses to inform policy. The of course, universities should not be allowed to overcharge the government systematically. Of course, federal science grants should not be used to impose identity group discrimination and DEI ideology on universities. And indeed, of course, the federal government should work to prevent foreign intellectual espionage in our universities. But we're forwarding these bills now, not just because they're good policy, but because they're necessary. American science policy has gone dreadfully wrong, and yet these bills are the minimum necessary to right its course. 7 of the 10 bills reform different parts of federal policy that weaponize the irreproducibility crisis to justify illiberal regulatory policy. And when I say weaponize the irreproducibility crisis, that vast amounts of scientific research is being produced that is just wrong and predictably wrong, and which is then used to justify mountains more of incorrect research and incorrect policy. So 3 of the bills reform regulatory policy. We call them the Reproducible Policy Act, Mathematical Modeling Reform Act, and Weight of Evidence Act. I should say, by the way, these bills are all on the NAS webpage. Go to www.nas.org, go to the policy tab, go to Model Science Policy Code. You'll find it. So another 4 bill reform grants policy, and these we call the Reproducible Grants Act, Replication Studies Funding Act, Negative Research Act, and Research Integrity Act. And we devote so many individual bills to reversing this crisis of liberty because it matters so much. Technocrats and radical activists embedded in government service, weaponize the powers delegated to federal science regulatory authorities, as well as the authority accorded to putatively nonpartisan scientific experts to advance their policy goals, without transparency or accountability, either to elected policymakers or the public. And yet, science policy is uniquely vulnerable to the ambitions of radical activists. And this is, the irreproducibility crisis of modern science, pervasive politicized groupthink, the shift to conducting research by means of culpably negligent statistical procedures. These produce masses of false positive results, then used by activist bureaucrats who actively commission them to justify the mass production of illiberal radical regulations throughout the federal science regulatory agencies. And scientific procedures ought to restrain arbitrary ideological policymaking, but the corruptions of politicized groupthink and misused statistics instead facilitate it. There's also the point that the federal government is the largest single funder of scientific in the research in the world. So federal funds, not only distort American regulatory policy, but also, scientific research, throughout American universities and indeed, in effect, throughout the world. Um, we have three further bills: Indirect Costs Act, Science Depoliticization Act, Science Natural Interest Act. They're equally important, frankly, but they can be addressed by relatively simple legislation. Um, this is model legislation. We expect legislators to adopt it. And frankly, since this is such an enormously detailed and significant part of federal policy, deeply interwoven with national security, we're sure that there ought to be details made to make sure that when you're reforming stuff, you don't bust something that exists, is necessary, and is good. So it's model, it's meant to be adjusted. All of our bills include the ability to grant waivers so long as they're cataloged, described, explained, justified, and you have the ability to challenge the waivers. But still, flexibility built in. We don't include enforcement mechanisms. Probably there should be some, but we figure that's better to be left to policymakers to figure out what's the appropriate enforcement mechanism. And I guess just the last thing, I mentioned national security. You can abuse this as a sort of an excuse. If you call climate change a national security issue, as people do, suddenly you're saying that climate change research is, immune to these regulations. You shouldn't be allowed to be cute. But we do think you should be thoughtful about genuine military and national security research. We want policymakers to apply these laws carefully and prudently. That's basically what we're doing as the presentation. And I'll stop there and say, Darren, would you be so kind as to speak first?
I will. Thank you, David. I appreciate it. And I want to address the big issue, which is why my hair won't go down. I can't do anything with it. I don't know what's going on with it. Anyway, so you'll have to deal with it. Anyway, I really appreciate the opportunity to speak here today about the Model Science Policy Code. I want to lay out why the code is so important, discuss some of the proposed bills. There are 10, as David pointed out, and then add some additional points and ideas. I'm glad, David, that you talked about the technocrats and the bureaucrats. I just do think, as kind of a preliminary matter, the Minister of State, there is what I call, regulation without representation. We're really concerned about taxation without representation. We need to be more concerned with regulation without representation. And that's a problem that Congress needs to address through different means. But if agencies are going to be developing policies that have a huge effect on our lives, which they do, then I think we should at least expect those policies to be informed by some sound science and have some good processes that exist to ensure that the public has some say in the science. So why is the code so important and necessary? Well, the science that the agencies use are used to actually inform these major regulations. And the agencies are not being shy in the types of regulations they issue. They are developing sweeping policies. So the EPA recently finalized a rule dealing with, some people call it the EV mandate. It's a rule that in effect will try to get rid of gas-powered cars. That rule will the compliance cost is expected to cost $760 billion. And that's a low ball estimate, really. That's just a compliance cost. The 2009 stimulus bill was projected to cost $787 billion. Just provide some context. So one agency issuing a rule that Congress, I'm sorry, did not provide, never said to get rid of gas-powered cars. So the agency really on its own is issuing a rule that's effectively the same cost as that massive stimulus bill from 2009. So provide some context as to how sweeping some of these rules are that agencies are issuing. If you have bad science, it leads to bad policy. You need these types of bills and reforms to ensure that that doesn't happen. And once you have bad science that the agencies kind of develop, it starts to become entrenched and it becomes very difficult to counter that science. It just kind of gets embedded. And then you have this kind of fruit of the poisonous tree situation for any new study following up. It first of all, just assume that the existing science is just true and everything else is just kind of built off of it. And that's a serious problem. Now, even when the federal government is not using the science to issue rules, and they're just disseminating science, such as studies, that still has a huge effect because the imprimatur of the government is significant. And when they disseminate the science, different studies, for example, it can create conventional wisdom. It can influence what other agencies do. It can influence their rules. We're supposed to have kind of an open process. And in the regulatory process, there's supposed to be public feedback on rules. The public is supposed to participate in rulemaking. So the Administrative Procedure Act of 1946 is supposed to be kind of the Bill of Rights for the regulatory process. And quite simply, it has failed to do so. Having access to underlying science and for the public to have a say in the science is a key component of having kind of a regulatory bill of rights, of really having a true and fair regulatory process for the public. And the public especially needs to be involved, given that agencies are often ignoring Congress that represent the people. So the public's chance to get a bite at the apple and to have a say on many of these policies is through the regulatory process and also having a say in the science that's being used for those rules. So David talked about the fact that the code would push for legislation. And I agree that legislation needs to be adopted. First of all, Congress can address science across the government. I know that certain politicians think they can just do whole government approaches. I'm not so sure that that's really appropriate. A lot of the things that agencies can do, and I think with the science you've seen in the past, is sometimes they'll do policies that are kind of internal to their agency. And it doesn't mean that it's kind of cross-cutting across government. Congress can address that. Legislation is much stronger than anything that the agency can do on its own internal policies. Congress can establish teeth. It's hard to get rid of legislation, as David said, in executive order or any type of internal agency type of document. There's constant change in administrations and different policies. So if one administration comes up with some strong science policies for their administration, it's very easy for the next administration to just get rid of it. And we see this constantly, not just with kind of internal types of guidance, but just rules, constantly changing rules. So there's very little predictability. And now I want to kind of talk about, real briefly, I think Marlo and John will talk about the problems of science a lot more than I will. But I think we talked about the replication and reproducibility of science being a problem. Now, that's not just a dig at the federal government. The problem of replication, reproducibility, and also peer review is something that exists in science outside of the government, not just the federal government. But the federal government has to be cognizant of the fact that science that they're using has these problems, and therefore the processes that they employ need to recognize that and take that into account. Of course, there are agency problems. There's a lack of transparency, especially in the rulemakings for the sciences. You can't get access to underlying data and models. And if you can't have that, then you can't figure out how the government and how the studies even worked. There's cherry picking of studies. The government often works backwards, tries to find studies that will support their kind of ideological agenda. And if you're not allowing the public, including experts, properly challenge the science, that becomes a problem. It's just you're hearing one side. You have advisory boards from different agencies that often are not objective. They're biased. They're not viewpoint. There's not a lot of viewpoints represented. And too often, policy choices are presented as science, conflating policy and science. So I want to briefly discuss some of the I'm going to discuss 3 proposed bills in the code just to make it manageable because I don't want to go through all 10, but there is some overlap. And I think the bills are really thoughtful. And let's start with the Reproducible Policy Act. Now, according to, I'm just going to read it, the federal government should not impose regulations based on research that is not publicly accessible and therefore not reproducible. Sounds good. I want to stress something. Scientists and researchers don't have a God-given right to have their science used in agency rulemaking. If they want their science to be considered, then look, they'll know what the rules of the game are. And agencies will give, and the government will give them a fair warning. If you want your science used, hey, it needs to be reproducible. Or, and then look, the goal is the best science. The top priority is making sure regulations are best based on the best science. If it's not reproducible, it's not the best science. Now, there's one specific provision in the bill that I want to draw attention to. It would require the EPA to have a commission that would review all significant regulatory actions and highly influential scientific assessments promulgated before a specific date, and I assume that date is probably the effective date of the law, and assess whether each significant regulatory action or highly influential scientific assessment still possesses sufficient scientific justification. This is really important. This gets back to this fruit of the poisonous tree point that I made. It's important to go back to a retroactive review of the science that's being used to inform the rules that are affecting Americans and to ensure that it's not junk science, that it actually is justified. And science should always be process should always be challenging the previous science. We shouldn't just assume things. One suggestion that I have is that this provision seems like a one-time commission that would do this on a one-time basis. I would actually suggest making this kind of retroactive review of the science more a regular practice. The second bill I'd like to talk about is the Replication Studies Funding Act. And as we'll hear more, is that replication is a serious problem. Look, the cool kids do the new research, and everybody wants to do the new research. And the problem is, if that new research is actually flawed, that's not so cool. So it's really critical that studies can be replicated. And we need to ensure that researchers out there have the incentive to replicate studies, to ensure that sexy new research is in fact actually real. Here's what the draft bill says, or actually was what the code says about the bill. It dedicates 10% of the funds for each research grant program to replication studies, especially to replication studies of government-funded research and to replication studies of research that justified or is proposed to justify a significant regulatory action or highly influential scientific assessment. So 10%, obviously, if you're drafting this bill, you can make it higher or lower. I'd probably go higher than the 10%. I think because we have such a in the short term, we have such a problem replication, it makes more sense to go higher. One of the things is that the language says 10% exactly. I think it probably should say at least 10% so that it can go higher. And if a greater emphasis is put on studies that can be replicated, then agencies will have the incentive by themselves to fund studies that can help replicate a study that they want to use in rulemaking. So you'll probably see a higher number if you give it that flexibility to go above 10%. The last bill I want to talk about real quickly is the Negative Research Act. And again, I'll read the summary. Federal grant programs should ensure that publication bias has not systematically distorted the discipline they fund. Omada bill reduces the government contribution to publication bias by requiring each granting program to catalog and describe the proportions of positive research results to negative and null research results, and not to fund any research grant program or scientific discipline which reports more than 65% positive results during 5 consecutive years of funding. Look, it's extremely valuable to know if something isn't true, to challenge and dispel incorrect assertions. if all the research is going to show that hypothesis A is correct, and scientists don't bother to try to correct that, then we're just going to hear one side. And then when they find out the hypothesis A is incorrect, oftentimes researchers just don't even bother publishing it. That's not good. That does a disservice to people, the knowledge. And this bill, I think, addresses that important problem. So finally, some additional points. David mentioned that the bills don't have enforcement mechanisms. I think that if the statutes, these bills, have clear procedural requirements in them, then it will be enforceable by courts. What you do is you codify the changes in the Administrative Procedure Act, and you just make it very clear that failure to meet such requirements would make the rule arbitrary and capricious. So the parties, the way it becomes enforceable is that the parties challenging the rule can bring up these procedural violations in court. That's how it can be done. It doesn't really require any, I don't think anything more specific than that. Some additional focus that hasn't been, I don't think is touched on too much, and I'll do this really quick. I'm running out of time here. There's the conflating of science and policy. I don't see this in the model code, but maybe it's there. I'll give you an example. The National Ambient Air Quality Standards for the EPA sometimes is presented as just being this purely scientific decision that the administrator sets the standards, and it's just like the science told us. But the truth is that is not some purely objective scientific decision. It is takes into account risk, which itself is subjective in nature. And it also takes into account factors that the administrator won't admit they're taking into account, like just the practical political realities. It makes more sense to just be honest about separating the science and the policy. And also when it comes to just statutes generally, we need to separate scientific decisions so they don't automatically trigger regulations. So that you have the agencies make scientific choices, and then regulations are a separate decision by agencies that take into account the science that they've considered, and hopefully is done well. And they also consider other trade-offs, costs, benefits, and that plays into the role. So the science is one piece of the puzzle in choosing whether or not to use science. I was just going to say that there are many instances, for example, there's one instance, the Science Advisory Board, and other instances of other advisory boards getting into issues that have absolutely nothing to do with science. For example, when it came to WOTUS issue back in 2020, that's the Waters of the United States, Clean Water Act issue, the Science Advisory Board came up with some type of commentary, which by itself should suggest it's not a science document. And it was basically a legal and policy document drafted by scientists. We don't create science advisory boards so that scientists can provide us their legal opinion. So one thing to do is perform these science advisory boards, make sure they stay on mission. Second thing I want to bring out is we need to have a very clear adversarial process through the rulemaking. That might be through maybe this red team, blue team type of idea, or it's a variation of formal rulemaking that exists. And formal rulemaking is kind of a hearing with testimony and cross-examination. Doesn't necessarily have to be like formal rulemaking from the past, but we could have a variation of formal rulemaking where parties are able to challenge the science, not necessarily the rule, but the science informing the rule. And actually, I'll leave it at that. And I just, again, want to thank everyone for participating, and also David for inviting me. Thanks.
Thank you so much. I must say, I was really taking notes on your suggestions with great avidity and thinking, okay, how soon can I update that web page? Anything else you ever want to say to say this should be, here's a suggestion for improvement, eagerly accepted, not just from you, but from everybody, including everybody in the audience. Yeah, these were modeled, also does not mean set in stone, eagerly want to improve. So thank you very much for that. Having said that, John, would you care to give the second presentation?
Sure. Thank you. Well, I want to thank the National Association for Scholars for the opportunity to share my thoughts on their effort to reform the federal science policy through their Model Science Policy Code. As the past president of the Health Physics Society, I'm here in my personal capacity to share how this national Association for Scholars policy code could strengthen the government agency's ability to create public policies based on sound science and free from political influence and activist agendas. The Health Physics Society is a scientific organization and, as such, seeks truth and transparency on how science may or may not be incorporated into today's standards, guidelines, or government policies associated with radiation protection. The NAS and the HPS have similar missions in that we both search for truth in science and believe transparency is a fundamental component in that effort. As such, during my time as HPS president, I led an effort to produce a documentary on the historical evolution of the linear no-threshold model for cancer risk assessment, which is commonly used in government policies today. I did this because the international community decided to review the entire system of radiation protection, and I felt the timing was perfect to create a series of videos describing how our protection standards evolved since the discovery of radiation in the 1890s. After all, if the international community is going to review the relevancy of current radiation protection standards to determine if they are fit for purpose, then we should understand how we got here. Anyone can watch those videos by Googling HPS History of the LNT. So why does any of that matter, and how does it relate to the NAS Model Science Policy Code? Well, let me answer this by asking a few questions that may resonate with you guys. First, have you ever been nervous about getting a medical exam that includes a chest x-ray, a dental x-ray, or a CT scan? Have you ever worried about being exposed to radon in your home or exposure to chemicals at your work or your home? Do you live near a nuclear power plant? Does that bring you anxiety or fear? What about radiological terrorism or the threat of nuclear war breaking out somewhere in the world? What are your feelings if you learn that nuclear fallout drifts over your community, lightly contaminating the food you eat and the water you drink? Are these fears justified, rational, and warranted given what science tells us about the risks associated with low-level exposure to radiation? And finally, do our government policies incorporate the latest science that address these questions? Well, the government policy that endorses the linear no-threshold model fuels your fears and gives you a false sense of safety by requiring local governments and industry to prevent or reduce exposures so low as there is no scientifically detectable public health benefit. Further, the tens of billions of tax dollars to achieve this are wasted on making you feel better, while these funds could have been used to address other real-world public health threats. The HPS testified to Congress about this in 2000, nearly 25 years ago. Yet the policy of using the LNT still stands today. The NAS efforts to reform federal science policy is a good start to ensuring if your fears are warranted or not, because it clearly defines the expectations of sound science that result in policies dedicated to protecting public health. I have spent my entire career in the federal government, either as a civil servant or as a commissioned officer in the U.S. Public Health Service. So I bring what I consider to be an insider's perspective on how the NAS Model Science Code could strengthen government agencies' abilities to create public policies based on sound science. Of the 10 acts described in the Model Science Code, I want to call out a few to illustrate my point. The Mathematical Modeling Reform Act would require federal agencies to use publicly accessible models in all forecasts, policymaking, and interventions. The Weight of Evidence Act would establish transparent weight of evidence judgments and require federal agencies to include negative and null studies as part of their assessments. The LNT model is the default one used by the US EPA to determine cleanup values for contaminated sites. The Nuclear Regulatory Commission often follows EPA's lead. In my recent publication, The Overt Scientific Bias and Clandestine Acts by Trusted Scientists, I exposed unethical conduct, strong personal biases, and actions taken by leaders within other scientific organizations and government agencies to prop up the long-standing policy of the LNT that is no longer supported by the latest science, especially at the exposures that you and I are exposed to every day. Let me be clear, EPA and NRC are government agencies, but an agency doesn't create the policy. It's the people in those agencies that does. For example, EPA has what I would consider to be an excellent scientific integrity policy that states science is the backbone of EPA's decision-making. That sounds great, but a senior career official within EPA stated that the L&T model is a quote-unquote set-in-stone policy, even though the latest science and the rest of the world does not support how EPA implements it. If the Mathematical Model Reform Act was passed, science would steer future policy changes and, in this case, would result in the process of educating the public on which models best represent the science. If the Weight of Evidence Act was passed, the EPA policy of excluding negative or null studies associated with radiation exposures would begin the process of including thousands of scientifically peer-reviewed publications that show no effect or even some beneficial effects from low-level radiation exposures. If you knew that such a volume of studies existed, do you think that might help you process your fears and anxiety about being exposed to low-level radiation? The Negative Research Act addresses the known issue of publication bias, where the scientific journals accept positive findings while rejecting negative findings. Obviously, positive findings could drive news cycles and result in more funding for research or profits for the journal. But FOIA emails exposed a senior leader within another scientific organization, which often gets funding from our government agencies because these agencies rely on their perceived objectivity and scientific independence for guidance. That congressionally chartered organization considered using their influential position to control the narrative on the LNT topic by writing a commentary to be published in the Journal of Radiological Protection, provided the journal abide by the organizational guidelines that no accompanying letters appear with the publication. This form of publication bias, potentially orchestrated by a congressional charter organization, adversely affects the scientific integrity of the very institutions we rely upon for objective guidance. Finally, the Research Integrity Act would require federal agencies to publish research integrity guidelines, fund researchers who adopt these guidelines, and prohibit funding for any researcher who had committed a serious research integrity violation. Suppressing scientific information that could alleviate our fears about being exposed to low-level radiation because it may contradict the long-standing policies or narratives or personal beliefs is not only unethical, but it would be addressed by this act. It actually happened and is presented in my paper. For example, another well-known scientific organization which our government agencies often go to for objective scientific guidance was charged to develop a research agenda to better understand effects from low-level radiation exposures. A prominent member of that committee convinced the chair to suppress information that was pertinent to the committee's charge because she considered it to be controversial. The chair of that committee acquiesced, but stated, quote, "We as a committee have not done a thorough review of the evidence behind your assertions." He expressed concern that the organization could be accused of suppressing uncomfortable truths. So very near the end of my term as HPS president in 2023, I became aware of these activities within our government and associated scientific organizations and realized the tremendous costs associated with the continued application of the outdated LNT policy. I wrote to Congress and the Senate requesting that they conduct an oversight investigation to ensure the latest science was being incorporated into our regulations and policies. 7 past presidents of the Health Physics Society endorsed that letter. If the National Association of Scholars model science policy was enacted, it would address these real-world examples, giving you more confidence to trust our government and scientific organizations. It does this by demanding transparency through the process of policy development. Much of what is in the code seems more like common sense and shouldn't be necessary, but without some form of guardrails to ensure scientific integrity is paramount, your fears may continue. Again, I want to thank the National Association for Scholars for this opportunity to comment on their model science code.
Thank you so much. Thank you. And it's wonderful, it's wonderful to hear the examples for why it's necessary, in the sense that it's wonderful to think one's doing proper work, but obviously, boy, do I wish it weren't necessary, which is another way of saying sympathies for all these troubles. So thank you very much. And I'm going to go now, if we may, to Marlo.
Well, thank you very much, David, and to the National Association of Scholars. I'm just delighted to be a part of this panel today, and I think I'll just start with a title of a very influential in my life, in any event, monograph that David wrote a couple of years ago called "The Irreproducibility Crisis in Modern Science," and that is certainly an important context for this whole discussion and for the model pieces of model legislation. And earlier this year, I happened to read a book that came out in 2020, which I highly recommend, by a British professor, Justin Ritchie, and it's called Science Fictions. And a great deal of the book is devoted to the irreproducibility crisis. And there are literally hundreds of examples. The book is exhaustive and exhausting reading, both, because of the number of examples of negligence, bias, hype, and in many cases, even outright fraud that somehow snuck past academic peer review and got published. And all of these studies, that have these problems are studies that cannot be reproduced. In some cases, they are irreproducible by virtue of the fact, actually, in many cases, that the critical data and computational methods are not transparent. They aren't shared with the public. But in some cases, there are attempts to reproduce them, and that effort fails because the science is so shabby. And I just want to share a few examples that the ones that really hit me hard. In fact, what you find is that replication studies or reproducibility studies, in order to test previous research to see whether independent investigators can get the same results, is applied to a very small segment of published research in for example, the field of economics. It may be 1% of all published studies, or excuse me, it's about 1/10%, 1/10 of 1%. In psychiatry, Ritchie reports, it's at least 10 times better. In other words, 1% of all the studies are re-examined later by independent researchers. Now, you would think that biomedicine would be a pretty hard science compared to a lot of the scientific research that is used as the basis for regulations. A lot of, for example, air pollution regulations are based on epidemiology, which is an observational, survey-based approach in which you cannot control for confounding variables. You have to try to find them and then sort of control them based on your inspection of all the factors that might have influenced the outcome. But it's not like you have a control group that you can compare with a test group. So the biotechnology company Amgen tried to replicate the results of 53 landmark studies of cancer drugs that were administered to lab animals or to human cells in vitro. And only 6 or 11% of those 53 landmark studies replicated. Many biomedical studies cannot be tested for reproducibility because they do not provide enough information. For example, one study found it took a random sample of 268 biomedical studies that all but one failed to report their full protocol. In other words, if you have a study that is being reviewed by the FDA requires you to register in advance your research protocol so that before you actually test any human volunteer, for example, you've laid out your research plan, you've stated your hypothesis, your main outcome that you expect, the subordinate outcome. And anyway, it turns out that in these 268 biomedical studies, about 54% of them didn't even fully describe what kind of animals, chemicals, or cells they used in the experiment. So who could ever reproduce that? Impossible. Now, how big a problem is this in terms of general public recognition within the science community? Well, it turns out, and I did a search on Google Scholar, that 84,100 papers in recent years have been published on the irreproducibility crisis. So, see, David, you're influencing not just the way Washington talks, but the way the scientific community talks. And a whopping 643,000 papers have been published on the replication crisis. Replication and reproducibility are often used as interchangeable terms. Some people distinguish them. They say replication has to do with laboratory sciences, where you're attempting to replicate the results of a lab experiment, but with a new data set, a new group of human volunteers or lab animals or whatever. Whereas reproducibility has to do more with observational studies, where basically what you're trying to do is check the math, see whether if you start with the same data and the same computational methods, you get the same results at the end. But I kind of just use them interchangeably here. And then there was a recent questionnaire that was posed by Nature magazine. They just said they invited people, so it's not a really scientific survey, because there's people are differently motivated to answer these kinds of survey questions. But it's interesting that of 1,576 active researchers who responded to questions from Nature magazine, do you think there's a reproducibility crisis in science? How serious do you think it is? That 52% of that more than 1,500 respondents judged that reproducibility is a significant crisis in modern scientific research, whereas 38% judged it to be a slight crisis. So in other words, about 90% said it was a crisis of one sort or another. Only 3% said there was no crisis, and 7% said they didn't know. Now, what is all of that preparatory to? Our good friend, the Environmental Protection Agency. The EPA had published a science integrity policy in 2012, and I would remind everybody that this discussion of reproducibility problems had been going on for years before 2012. One of the landmark studies that caught everybody's attention by John Ioannidis was titled "Why Most Research Results Are Published Research Results Are Wrong." That came out in 2005. So I looked through the EPA's science integrity policy from 2012, and guess what? The document does not contain the word reproduce, replicate, or any related words like reproduction, reproducibility, replicability. It's invisible. in the EPA's science integrity policy in 2012? Well, recently, the EPA just this year updated its science integrity policy. So I looked through that document to see whether, they're at least they've at least become Johnny come latelys, that they are starting to pay attention to this. Well, I'm sorry to disabuse any one of their illusions, but there's virtually no mention at all. It only to this extent, and it really is pitiful. The EPA affirms in one sentence, in one place in this document, that the EPA, quote, makes all of its data, models, and code publicly available to allow the public to reproduce EPA scientific results. So you have this affirmation that, hey, we're, a reproducible science agency. They don't give any examples to document that. In other words, they want us to take on faith that they're an evidence-based organization. But the important thing is that there is no goal or plan anywhere in this, or commitment anywhere in this document to improve the reproducibility, to increase the reproducibility of the various studies, the various types of research that EPA relies on in its rulemaking. There is no inkling in this document. I mean, if you've never heard of the reproducibility crisis, or the irreproducibility crisis, or replication crisis, you would not know that such a thing exists from reading EPA's science integrity policy. So that is the status quo with which we must deal. And so I commend what David is doing. I mean, David has been doing pioneering, path-breaking work in this area now for years, but this is certainly the way to go. These agencies will never clean up their own act unless Congress steps in and makes them do it. Now, I want to underscore that by just giving everybody a quick history lesson. This rot is very deep because it has been going on for a long, long time. How long? Well, I don't know exactly when the first book on public choice theory was written. Maybe Darren remembers, Do you remember what year it was published? Anyway, let's just say this, that good old President, former General Dwight David Eisenhower, called public attention to this problem in his farewell address. This goes all the way back to 1961. And most of us who remember this speech at all, or who've read about it at all, are aware of Eisenhower's warning to the public of the danger of a military-industrial complex. He said that we must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence, whether sought or unsought, by the military-industrial complex. So that warning is very well known because, in fact, it's congenial to a certain faction within our body politic that I won't name because it's too obvious to name, and I don't want to look like I have a party bias, which of course I don't. Actually, I have a liberty bias, and so that I plead guilty to that. But in any event, what Eisenhower also talks about here is how government funding of scientific research can corrupt science, and how corrupt science can subvert democracy, or can subvert accountable representative government. And these are big problems that David is addressing through his model legislation. So here's what Eisenhower said. He observed that there is a steadily increasing share of scientific research conducted for, by, and at the direction of the federal government. This is already in 1961, and he shows that there's a connection between this and the military-industrial complex because, like it or not, we actually need government funding and direction of research in order to have the best military, the best fighting force in the world. But then back right around right after World War II ended, around 1946, I believe, under Vannevar Bush, no relation to the Bush family, there was this effort to extend federal funding of research from the military to all types of science, that this would somehow make our life better, and in many ways it has. But in any way, Eisenhower observed that because most federal funding, or as then he said, an increasing share is conducted for, by, and at the direction of the federal government, a government contract has become virtually a substitute for intellectual curiosity. So in other words, the whole direction of inquiry by academics, professional academics, what they think are important questions to work on, and unfortunately also what answers they think might be most congenial to their funders, began back in the late 40s. And now it's come to the point where grantsmanship basically determines what it is that you study as a professional researcher. And the problem is, Eisenhower says, is that with federal funding comes the danger of federal control. In his words, the prospect of domination by the nation's scholars, by federal employment, project allocations, and the power of money is ever present and is greatly to be regarded. And that's the state of play that we've had for decades. And some of the totals of government funding and the domination of government agency funding by whole areas of research has reached gigantic proportions. So, for example, nearly all research, climate-related research, not just in the United States, but in the world, is funded by governments. And most of U.S., it's well over 90%, although I can't back that up. But who else is funding climate research in the United States to any degree except the federal government, which means agencies? Now, the EPA, interestingly enough, only has a small piece of the funding for the U.S. Global Change Research Program, which is the group of, I think it's 15 agencies now, or maybe it's 13, but I think it's 15 that put together these national climate assessment reports every 5 years or so. So they only have a small share of that. However, they're a big part of the intellectual content. So, for example, the 2017-2018 fourth assessment report by the U.S. GCRP, which is funded to the tune of billions of dollars a year, was provided by the EPA, which it's called its multi-sectoral analysis of the damages of climate change. Nearly all air pollution research in the United States is funded by the EPA. There's a book here that I have on my desk. Whoops. I don't know which way you can see it best. There you go. Because I'm seeing myself inverted. There's a chapter in there by Jason Johnston, a University of Virginia law professor, and he tries to tote up how much money the EPA has spent just on research of fine particulate matter, or PM 2.5, since 1999. Now, why is that an important date? Well, that's when EPA big time started funding fine particle matter research, and they basically provided enough money with grants at that time it was grants to 5 separate new institutes scattered about in 5 different prestige universities, and it was those grants were anywhere from $7 to $8 million grants, and then those have been repeated over the years. The grants sometimes extend for 3 years, sometimes more, sometimes they're renewed. And in 2012, 2 more of these PM research centers were created, again with EPA funding. And then there's another one called the Health Effects Institute, which is jointly funded with the automobile industry. But altogether, Jason Johnston estimates about $210 million has come from the EPA for PM 2.5 related research since 1999. And the thing to keep in mind is that these now 7 major centers that are just devoted to that would not exist but for that funding, and that the Health Effects Institute basically owes half of its funding from the EPA, which means that the EPA is the major funder. So what we have is an EPA-centric funding system for air pollution research. EPA is the financial center of gravity for that whole field. And so what are the odds that anyone whose salary and promotions and publications all depend on that EPA-funded research would decide at a certain point that, hey, maybe PM 2.5 is not as dangerous or lethal as the EPA says it is? There's just an amazing conflict of interest going on here. And how to deal with that is a very difficult problem. I would just say, David, that is a 2.0 project for you. I would not deal with that first, but something has to be done directly to diversify the funding of policy relevant research or regulatory science in order to prevent a single faction from exercising an undue influence. And I would say that the model for reform, and I certainly haven't worked it out in any detail, would be James Madison's extended republic, which we see in Federalist 10, where the solution to the problem of faction, which is any group of any size motivated by an interest or a passion or ideology adverse to the rights of others or to the what they call the permanent aggregate interests of the community, what we today would call the public interest, where the solution is not to try to abolish faction, which was the attempt that had been made by previous polities in history, which always, of course, led to tyranny, because as Madison pointed out, the causes of faction are sown in the nature of man. The solution, rather, is to multiply and diversify the number of factions so it is less likely that you have one dominant faction. And so that would be a long-term goal, I think, of making science more accountable, transparent, and reproducible, is that you would not try to eliminate the role of self-interest in research, because that's impossible, but you would try to create a more open and competitive system, which is open to a greater number and variety of interests, so that it isn't all cartelized or centered around one agency, which, being a regulatory agency, of course, has a massive interest, a factional interest, in growing its power and influence at the expense of other institutions and markets in general. So I think maybe with that, I will stop and welcome people's questions.
Thank you so much. I'm going to say, by the way, one of the questions or the comments is somebody wants all the references in your article. If you might be willing to either send your speech or the references to, well, Kaylee, she could then post it on the webpage / send it out to everybody who signed up for this. That would be, I think, a convenient way to get your sources, at any rate, out to people. Because in fact, everything you've read, I think everybody now wants to read too.
Well, that's okay. Basically, I have written up my sources. This is a paper that I'm working on, and so the paper is nowhere near ready to share with people. The sources, and I'm not even sure. I guess I could find it for the things I said, because I kind of know what paragraphs I was reading from. But a lot of it comes from Justin Ritchie. However, from his book, Science Fictions. Some of it comes from your good friend, Stan Young, from the irreproducibility crisis in modern science, your monograph, and so I ought to be able to put those together, although I don't know how rapidly I can do that. I guess I can have it by early next week, if that would be good enough.
Speaking on behalf of all our distinguished viewers, that would be wonderful. And,
Okay.
and again, if and when you do, we'll be glad to send it out to everybody who signed up. So, having said that, I'm going to speak for first Catherine Kelly, whose first question on this list is, what, if anything, do you think will be the effect of the important SCOTUS Chevron ruling on science policy, to any and all? Be glad to hear from anybody who wants to speak to that.
Yeah, I saw that question in the chat. So that case was Loper Bright, and it basically got rid of the Chevron doctrine. I don't think the effect will be significant, if at all. It doesn't really go after science, and it's focused on the Chevron doctrine is focused on statutory interpretation by an agency of ambiguous statutes. So I don't think that will have much effect on the science. I do want to point out, actually, since I saw that question, there was a case in the DC Circuit in August. It's called Huntsman Petrochemical versus EPA. It was August 13th ruling. And the court, DC Circuit, very important court, basically was saying that they're going to give extreme deference to the science. So I would say that that's a disturbing case that needs to be paid attention to and addressed, this idea of extreme deference to the science. So I don't think, at least DC Circuit is not taking Loper Bright as making any real difference when it comes to the science.
May I ask, actually, then to follow up, is there a judicial ruling equivalent, shall we say, to Chevron, which should be overturned, which would have a material effect on science policy?
Yeah, probably that case I just said.
Just that.
But I'm sure they're probably pointing to other cases. There's nothing that I can think of like landmark, but look, Congress really has to do a lot of the heavy lifting, not beyond the science, but also the regulatory process. That includes the science and the scientific process. And this idea of extreme deference is just absurd. The truth is, the courts actually created the problem with Chevron. The Administrative Procedure Act made it clear that courts were supposed to interpret statutes. They weren't supposed to give the deference to the agencies. It didn't say no deference because Congress in 1946 didn't think what was going to happen was that the court in the 1980s was going to create this whole deference idea to agency interpretations of ambiguous statutes. But the statute, they didn't anticipate enough because it said that questions of law should be answered by the courts, and the courts just simply ignored it. In the Chevron case from 1984, I believe, some justices that we probably like, Scalia, never mentioned that provision in the APA, Administrative Procedure Act. And now in the court, in the Loper Bright case, really relies a lot on the Administrative Procedure Act and pointing to it. So it's not just it's really kind of a statutory interpretation case too.
Thank you. Does anybody else want to speak to the Marlo?
Well, it's not directly on it, but I am reminded that the EPA once really tried to make an important step in the right direction, and that was their transparency rule under the previous administration. But it was a very mild-mannered, almost milquetoast proposal. All it said was that the EPA should give greater consideration to reproducible studies than to non-reproducible studies. And they took a lot of flack, of course, from the establishment. The people who are, who do research funded at the direction of the federal government. And so this very mild transparency proposal, all it would do would be to incentivize the production of reproducible research just by saying if you do make this transparent enough for independent validation, then we'll give greater consideration to it. They were instantly attacked as having set the stage for a public health crisis. Children would die, all kinds of good science would never be used. So it was actually a form of censoring science rather than transparency. Anyway, but they also made the argument that because the statutes the EPA administered did not specifically list transparency and reproducibility as a criterion of best available science, that EPA could not use that criterion in assessing scientific research relevant to rulemaking. And unfortunately, the previous administration, EPA in the previous administration, was somehow forgot what science is, didn't realize that real science must be repeatable and that repeatability is impossible without transparency. And so they didn't say, look, you bums, the whole idea of transparency is inherent in the idea of science. If you cannot repeat the results of a study or an experiment, you have no idea whether it's science or not. This universe we're in apparently has some regularities in it, which is why we always say that in science, if someone can get these results, someone else should be able to get them too, as long as they have the requisite training and tools. So reproducibility is a premise of science, and it's just another way of saying there are regularities in the universe. And but of course, as you put it in one of the model bills, David, research that is not available cannot be reproduced. So they didn't make their stand on this basic, simple proposition, and they retreated into this silliness that, oh, well, the transparency rule is just a housekeeping measure. It deals only with internal agency procedure. And so the DC Circuit Court of Appeals shot it down. No, it isn't just that. And it obviously wasn't that. Anyway, I really like the way you deal with that. And I would just say that, as part of, I think this emerges as an implication of your legislation, but maybe it's also explicit and I just missed it, which is that an agency should put give a great deal more credit to replicated research that has actually been independently validated, than research that is only in principle susceptible to reproducible testing. And of course, should give no consideration to research that is irreproducible, that simply cannot be, the results cannot be repeated for whatever reason, including that the researchers won't share their data and computational methods with the candid world. So I'm not sure that was exactly relevant to your question, but it had to do with the legality. I guess it did, in the sense that I was trying to address the sort of the legal considerations that may have a bearing on today's discussion. And of course, that is the very reason why we need legislation to clarify things like that, which were left vague by the previous administration's transparency rule, which was why I think it was only in effect for about 2 weeks before the DC Circuit Court shot it down.
Thank you. I'm going to go actually from here to a question by Richard Williams, who has a question about weight of evidence. Only recently have journals begun publishing negative and null studies. What's more, there is a great deal of subjective choosing as to which studies to include, and there are often no selection criteria published beforehand. The result is that you can get the result you want. Now, hi, Rich. I'm actually going to answer this directly myself first. And then ask if the commenters want to also say something about it. Um, Comment one. So this is a model science policy code, which also includes the bit about requiring the government to fund more negative replication results and look for the negative research. Ideally, those together would make this a diminishing problem, that there would be more negative studies that would be required, that would be available for people to use. Um, the second thing is to say that in fact, the weight of evidence, you've got transparency, and then you're supposed to use coherent arguments that can be falsified by independent critique. I think that requirement goes some way towards making it possible for there to be an independent critique, which can, among other things, say, well, there just aren't an awful lot of negative studies here, and therefore, this is something which needs to be addressed. And the third thing I would say is I'm not sure that this policy code as written is a full answer for that, for which it's one part, yeah, everything's a work in progress. But I think more to the point, you can't solve everything with the legislation. This is an attempt to solve a lot. I think you've found something where it wouldn't be perfect. I think having the regulatory ideal of the law would matter a lot, even with holes like that. Um, I would love to say that I could come up with a bell and whistle that would solve that, but I think I want to retreat to say I think the code as a whole will make things better. I don't think it or any piece of legislation can solve everything, where everything includes willfully malfeasant and non-feasant scientists and bureaucratic experts. Uh, there can only be partial solutions. So that's what I am standing on, that somewhat pessimistic, but I hope realistic ground. Does anybody else want to speak to this?
Well, I'll just offer, I think you do address weight of evidence, in you have a piece of legislation on that. And so more weight should be placed on evidence that has been reproduced and somewhat less on evidence that's reproducible and little to none on evidence that's irreproducible. So I think you have covered that, David. I would just, this is just Darren came up with this phrase, popularity contest. Unfortunately, weight of evidence today often means the most, he who has the most number of studies in support of his conclusion wins Miss Popularity, and that's the weight of evidence. And of course, that is a rigged game when you have, for example, an agency like EPA, which funds almost all of the studies in certain fields. So if you just count them up, yeah, the weight of evidence supports the EPA, but that's not a real weight of evidence test. Now, if you actually had a number of replicated studies, then among those, maybe numbers would count. But quality has to come first, then quantity, I would say.
I'll just add to that, Mario. It's a very good point. And Darren, David, I totally agree with you on the weight of evidence issue. Speaking from EPA, I worked there for 14 years and looking at their risk assessments, specifically on the radiation side, they specifically exclude science that does not show a positive result. So they are purposely saying that as part of our policy, we will ignore any studies that do not show a positive result. Now, that's clearly lack of science. And they're doing that in one respect, and partly in defense of that, is they want to be conservative in their assessment of it. But that's not sound science. Sound science is let the data speak for itself. And by excluding that, and I mentioned it in my comment, thousands of studies that also have been repeated show no effect, but yet they exclude those from their analysis for radiation. It's just kind of was shocking to me in that one. So your weight of evidence argument was really hit home to me because I worked at that agency, and I found that one particularly interesting to see that as a policy, we're ignoring science.
Yeah. And I'll just interrupt again just to mention that what people are talking about, I believe, is in the Reproducible Policy Act, quantitative assessments, that the administrator of, the EPA, whatever agency, shall establish a quantitative measure of how often scientific research has been confirmed by replication studies, apply that measure to the relevant databases, and incorporate this quantitative assessment into its assessments of scientific weight of evidence. So that doesn't, when I say, so when I was being apologetic, that doesn't fix the problem that there may not be negative and null studies available. Though frankly, they're probably in the file drawer as often as not. But it does at least get that bit about assessments. I am going to shift over to the chat thing with a question from Dean Musavi. If data at results cannot be shared for replication and should not be considered science, this puts an end to the knowledge of the elders, quote unquote, in an indigenous science, especially, quote unquote, that is only accessible by certain people or at certain times. Thoughts? This is a slightly different subject.
Yeah.
I have
Yeah.
thoughts, but who else has thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I think indigenous knowledge or knowledge of the elders, whatever you want to call it, should certainly be used and inform rules, whatever. But just because we shouldn't, therefore, somehow, just like we shouldn't conflate policy with science, we shouldn't conflate this type of knowledge or historical understanding as science, as the way we talk about science. That's not to minimize the knowledge, and that's not necessarily even to say that it's not as valuable necessarily. It just, let's not call it, it's not science. That's fine. But it doesn't mean exclude it. It should play a part when appropriate.
Yeah, I think Darren's completely correct about that. And remember, rulemakings are informed by public comment generally. And I've submitted comments. I've never had them peer reviewed before I submitted them. I never tried to reproduce the results. I mean, it's a comment. And Frederick Hayek, told us that what's most important in most decisions in life is what you might call local knowledge, which cannot be replicated because it's here today, gone tomorrow, and it's only in this spot. And it's the reason why central planning doesn't work, because the central planner doesn't have access to local knowledge. But local knowledge, however valuable, and indispensable for human welfare, and however important it can be in informing a rulemaking, should not be confused with scientific research.
Yeah, I think sorry, John, did you want to speak to this? Okay. I would say the crucial thing is, that is, only, it's the knowledge of the elders, which it implies no one else can criticize it, which is the problem. And actually, getting back to character, I mean, part of the scientific character ought to be humility. That includes openness to, well, everybody, and not just, the professional elite. Part of that is if somebody says, hey, look at this leaf is actually a useful drug, give it a whirl, to be open to that. But if you then say there's another closed group which cannot be criticized, and in this case on, racial, ethnic grounds, that's rejecting humility in a different direction. So I guess I would say one of the ways to look at it would be, this is not a question of government policy, but that the spirits of charity and humility, I think, are appropriate here against excessive, well, snobbery by professional scientists and excessive exclusivity by, elders, etc. Having said that, there's a question from Michelle, and this may, I think, actually be the last question before we get to any closing comments. Are there any current policies, good or bad, with bias or not, existing on renewable energy at this time? What policies may be required if not in place? Any comments on renewable energy will be appreciated. To any and all.
Well, I'll start first, and I can speak from this from the health physics standpoint. We have actually a position statement on nuclear power. Obviously, it's the best form of nuclear energy, carbon-free and very safe, safer than any other industry with regard to renewable energies. We need more policies that adopt that based upon, obviously, the demand that's going, rather than what is considered to be, I guess, more politically correct with wind and solar and pushing these things. I would argue that all sources of energy, no matter what, should be looked at for renewables, and each has its application, but none come close to what nuclear energy can do for meeting the demands of the future societies around the world. And as we move forward in this direction, I think what's really important, and why the L&T became something of an interest of mine, and it wasn't that I was taking a position, I learned along that process. That policy in and of itself is the one hampering our ability to produce more nuclear power plants, small modular reactors, or even larger reactors around the world. We are lagging China and other countries who are moving forward in the nuclear power industry. So, I think that with renewable energies, nuclear power needs to be looked at, and the policy of implementing L&T, which basically harms that industry, says, geez, a little bit of radiation is going to cause you a cancer or lead to a risk that you believe, and you're so afraid you go against something that is carbon free, help the world, and meet our energy demands. So that's my diatribe on the renewable energies with nuclear power.
Thank you. Darren or Marlo?
I mean, I could probably talk forever about the problems with policies of renewable energy, so I won't, but let me just say that, in simple terms, the Inflation Reduction Act, with all the subsidies for renewable energy, wind and solar, with renewable portfolio standards on the state level for all the other subsidies for renewable energy, for all the regulations that exist to get rid of reliable electricity sources like coal, natural gas, etc. Everything is trying to push towards renewable electricity, shift that direction, and move away from reliable electricity sources like coal, natural gas, and to some extent nuclear. And that by itself overall is really bad policy, because our number one objective should be reliable, low cost electricity, and that when we flick on the switch, we should expect the electricity to come on. And right now, the policies that we have, and as we try to increase demand for electricity through like EVs and other things, which create more problems, we're going to create all kinds of problems for the grid. And so the renewable energy policies that exist are connected to this problem with the grid, and we're going to have brownouts and blackouts. And I fear that it's really going to require some type of serious blackout or brownout in multiple states or wherever to maybe have people kind of realize what's going on. So there's a lot of bad policies. It's hard to know where to start.
Thank you. And Marlo, anything you wanted to conclude us with?
Conclusion.
Oh, sorry, I meant for this particular topic, and then I'd be asking everybody just have an overall conclusion.
Yeah, I guess that you've taken care of this in your model legislation in various ways, but yeah, I think it helps often to force agencies to have a simple checklist that they can show that they've looked at certain things they're supposed to. And so I came up with one that would that, let's say, for the EPA, for any study that they're going to use in a rulemaking, they should have to say yes or no. Was the study time-stamped with pre-registered hypothesis and reached the research plan before any data was collected? 2, was the study does the study timestamp and archive its original data prior to data cleaning, so we can be sure that no one monkeyed with the data after it started to be analyzed? And you can have another three sort of columns that you check off. Are all data, all models, and code accessible for independent review? Yes or no? Are all results, negative as well as positive, reported? Are any changes in methods in midstream duly recorded? That would be another thing. Yes or no? Whether the study has been tested for reproducibility or not. That's another one. And then finally, well, there are other things that are a little bit more technical, but one of the things that I've learned from your colleague Stan Young is that the more questions that researchers ask of a data set, the bigger the chance is that they will get false positives, And so in typical epidemiological studies, sometimes as many as 13,000 questions or more might be asked, which means that you're pretty much guaranteed of getting 695 false positive results. And so this correction for this problem of multiple testing and modeling of the same data set should be done. And so that's another thing that you'd want EPA to tell you. Was there a test done on that to correct for those distortions or not? So just that simple idea, I think, of producing a handy checklist that an agency can certify this study passes the test, passes this many out of all the number of tests and failed in the others. So anyway, I think that might be a useful thing at some point.
Thank you. Well, I'm going to ask then if people would have, 30 to 60 seconds in conclusion, and then I'll just do sort of a final wrap up. I guess in the same order. Darren, would you be kind enough to go first?
Yeah, one thing we didn't mention was the Information Quality Act. There's a question in the chat about making sure the scientific information is accurate. And so over about 25 years ago, Congress recognized all the problems with peer review and reproducibility, and they passed something called the Information Quality Act. It's a law that's intended to ensure that government disseminated information is accurate, it's not misleading. Unfortunately, it has not had the teeth that it's supposed to. One of the reasons why is because when OMB implemented the law through its bulletin and guidelines, it created all kinds of discretionary language for agencies so that it was almost impossible to enforce it for courts, or at least courts argue that. So anything, just generally speaking, for the model code and for all the policies that we're thinking about when it comes to science, it's very important to have very objective criteria that makes it very clear that the agencies have to meet it, and also that it's easy for the court to enforce it. Then you have something that really the court can actually, you can't provide deference to anything like that because you're just simply reviewing whether or not, if the agency met certain procedural requirements, objective requirements, and failed to do so, then it's arbitrary, capricious, and that's it. Shoots it down, goes back to the agency to redo its rule. And thank you very much, David, and National Association for Scholars, and Marlo and John, and everybody, the participants. It's been great.
And thank you so much. And John, if you would be so
Sure,
kind.
I'll just real quickly. I wanted to start off real quick answering one of Michelle's questions in the chat because I think it's very worthwhile putting in my concluding statement. How do we protect ourselves from misinformation coming from the right or from the left on scientific subjects? In my opinion, the answer is simple: transparency. Let the data speak for itself and have a high degree of scientific integrity. That's where our field, that is our area, and we need to stay true to ourselves and our field. So being transparent shows that we're not afraid of being wrong, and we will fix those things and we will move forward and learn from it. That's how science and society and public health evolves over time. So that's it.
Thank you very much. And Marlo.
Oh, yeah, I would just say that, and this is a point that Darren touched on. I think it's really, it would really be great if people who had grievances about any of the way agencies have used science, interpreted science, selected science in order to support their preferred policy conclusions, have an opportunity to engage the agency experts on the record in in a fair debate on a level playing field. So Darren mentioned this, that some kind of public hearing that would be different than the old-fashioned formal rulemaking, which hasn't really been done since the 1970s because it was like a negotiated settlement, and that's not what we're talking about here, but a real debate. And in that sense, give people who have citizens who think that they have found a real problem with agency science their day in court, their ability to make the case and have the agencies respond to it, not with deference to their conclusions, but under some kind of umpire who will just simply enforce the rules of evidence and the rules of conduct in a judicial proceeding.
Thank you. Okay, thank you so much. I'm going to say thanks, advertisements for what's up, and just reminders of things about this. So I guess reminders first. If you still have questions and they weren't answered, please send them to me, Randall at nas.org, RANDALL at nas.org. Be delighted to forward them to the panelists so that they can have the option to answer you. And again, this is videotaped, not recorded. It'll be on our National Association of Scholars YouTube channel within 24 hours. Thank you. Thank you to the panelists. So it's wonderful that you appeared. We're deeply grateful. And again, and gosh, and in fact, and we're hoping that this will, make the NAS Science Policy Code be better known, where ideally this will make for better governance and better science, which is what we want. Thank you to the audience. We do it for you. We can't do it without you. The Q&A comes from you, and those were a lot of really great questions. Thank you so much. I just want to sort of advertise some stuff. People have been mentioning my colleague Stan Young. The fourth of our Shifting Sands reports will be published in October, Zombie Psychology, and this is talking about the effects of irreproducibility and implicit bias theory, and the implicit association test, which is not so much important for federal regulation, although there are bits there, but for state and local, to speak nothing of what private companies are doing. And I think it's actually really important for saying that the irreproducibility crisis and its effects are not just how they affect federal regulation. There's a whole swath of government and society where all this is at issue. And frankly, it then ties in, for implicit bias, to this whole DEI CRT revolution in deeply unfortunate ways. So anyway, coming here in October, and a follow-up to that ideally is going to be sort of a final synthesis set of policy recommendations report for all of our Shifting Sands. That's probably going to be early in 2025. Stay tuned for that one. But ideally, that will, in effect, be able to get 4 reports worth of data, highly compressed, and then the conclusions for what should be done, all in one hopefully lucid and accessible place and manner. So, that's it for what's coming up here for science. Of course, we're doing everything else in NAS. You should look at our webpage, become a member if you haven't become a member, donate your firstborn child and all his earnings to us if you haven't done that yet. Good stuff like that. And I'll end with thank you all so much